was an opportunity to draw upon some of the people that Joe Turner and myself have interviewed for the past, 3 years maybe, and some of you sitting here we've also interviewed. But I've asked these people because it represents a nice cross-section of Bridgeton, and they had some especially interesting stories that I want to share with you. And I hope after they share these stories that you'll want to look up their interview on the computer. I think maybe Joe has the address. He will give you a piece of paper that you can easily access the information. And also, if you or anyone else would like to volunteer to be interviewed by Joe and myself, it's rather painless, I'm sure. We just come in to wherever you'd like to meet with us. We talk for about an hour. You know, it's fun. We had, before we start with our panel, I just wanted to say, we had an interview this week with a couple, Alice and Terry Schaffner. You might know her as Alice Robbins Schaffner. And I knew Alice because we had daughters on the Pat Mill drill team together. But I had in no way known what she was going to tell us about. And it was absolutely fascinating. And it involved her family's house being in the way of the building of Highway 70. And so Highway 70 came along and bought half of their lot, and her father actually had his house moved. And maybe some of you have seen houses being moved. When I lived in Normandy, Highway 70 came through and we saw houses being moved. But they had no electricity and no plumbing for months and months. Can you imagine a young girl of 10 going through that? And then 2 years later, the house burnt down completely while they were at church one day. So her story was absolutely fascinating. I in no way expected to hear it. I was sitting there absolutely fascinated with it. And I invite you to look up her story, and she's a very good speaker. She's been an educator, and so I invite you to do that. We have a very fun panel of people up here today, and I'm going to introduce them. We have Jenny Banker-Turner, we have Kathleen Telscher, Kevin Heidebreeder,
close enough.
and Floyd and Mary Patton. They each have very interesting stories to tell. What I would like to do is pull out from them some of the things that I thought were particularly interesting. And then after we do, I invite you to ask them questions, or if they want to add something else, or we can talk about a current event, very current, going on in Bridgeton. But first of all, I'd like to start with Mrs. Telscher. Mrs. Telscher, were you born here in Bridgeton?
Yes, on this road.
And raised in Bridgeton?
Right.
And worked in Bridgeton for many years?
Right.
And one thing Mrs. Telscher told us about that I enjoyed so much was when she went to school. Can you tell us about where you went to school?
Well, I went to St. Mary's grade school from first grade through 8, and then I went to Pattonville for 4 years. Then I didn't go to college because it's a long story about that. But when I went to St. Mary's, I was 5, and my mother started me in first grade because my sister was 6, and she was going, and she thought it would be good if we went together. So we were both in the same grade, but we were a year apart. And then she asked me if I'd tell this story. When I was in 3rd or 4th grade, I guess it was 4th grade, the nuns wanted to let me skip a grade because I always had my hand up for the answers and didn't give the other children a chance. And so my mother refused to let me be pushed up ahead because then I'd be ahead of my sister and be a year younger. And that was her first farm, so she couldn't stand that. So the nun said, well, I guess what we'll do, they lived above the school, the nuns did. She said, we'll have you come to school but we'll have you go upstairs. Well, we didn't have any books at home. The only book we had was one that my dad had gotten from an aunt, Ben-Hur. And I was in the 4th grade, that's all I had to read at home. So when I got to go up to this nun's living quarter, they had a library. Oh my goodness, I was in heaven. So I spent a year up there. And of course, my sister would bring home the stuff they were doing, and if I had homework, I could get it from them. And then when I went to Pattonville, I was 13, and I was a freshman, and Mr. Holman came to me, and it was wartime.
Wait a minute, excuse me, who was Mr. Holman?
I guess he was superintendent of schools.
Okay.
I'm sorry that I'm not sure, but I think
That's
that's
okay.
what the title was. And he said, you know, with the shortage of teachers, if somebody has an emergency appendectomy or something, we don't have any teachers. We need a substitute teacher. He said, would you fill in as a substitute teacher? Well, here I was, 13 years old and a freshman in high school. I taught 8th grade, and the boys were taller than me, but what respect they had. My one older daughter later taught in Japan 2 years, and she also taught in Chicago. And when she came back from 2 years in Japan, they had bowed to teachers there. And up in Chicago, they threw spit. And they'd follow her home at night, and they'd have guns in their vans, and they'd be shooting off in front of her apartment. And so, anyway, I'm just mentioning that because these kids were so respectful. Oh, it was wonderful. Those boys never, ever gave me any trouble. And I taught 1st grade, 3rd grade. It was fun. And then I worked in the library, and I worked for Mr. Holman. He had a full-time secretary, but he had me do things.
Did you get paid when you were a substitute teacher?
Oh, yeah, I got the teachers paid. Yeah.
Did you go
Turned
to
it into
school?
my parents.
Did you go to high school though? I mean,
Yeah, I was a freshman, but I was doing.
when did you teach? If you were at school, when did you teach?
Well, I didn't really go to school when I was teaching. I would teach maybe for 6 weeks, and then I'd come back to the, but I always was able to do my homework.
So you just taught like in.
I'm not a sleeper. I always slept about 4 hours a night all my life. I don't like to sleep. I feel like I'm wasting time.
How many of our audience are involved or have been involved in education?
I've gone to school.
Probably not as a teacher. I mean, not as a teenager.
Oh,
I'd like to shift.
when I was in grade school, it was a Catholic grade school, I was in 4th grade, and the nun got sick in 1st grade and she had to leave. And another girl in my classroom in 4th grade, and I had to go over there and, I guess, eat peace or whatever. We were teachers. I thought that was funny, but yours is worse. You're 1st grade, I was at least in 4th. But I was thinking that, what is 4th grader doing taking kids in 1st grade?
I was a freshman in high school.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'm just younger than you.
I was 13.
I'd like to shift now over to this side of the table to Floyd and Mary Pat. Now, you were not born and raised in Bridgeton, either of you.
No, ma'am. We lived in Bridgeton area after 1955.
Where were you originally from?
Well, I was born in Kansas. We both grew up in the Kansas City area.
And what brought you to Bridgeton?
Well, I worked in McDonald Aircraft.
How many people here have someone who worked at McDonald Aircraft? Lots of them.
Well, she was raised in Kansas City. She was born in Kansas City. But we met in Kansas City, and the rest is history.
Well, when you were telling us about coming to Bridgeton, and you lived off of Old St. Charles.
We lived on Old St. Charles.
Oh, okay, you lived on Old St. Charles. Can you kind of pinpoint it for us?
Well, I can't give you the exact address. When we first moved to Bridgeton, of course, we were young. We had a couple daughters. We lived in a two-car garage.
Did everybody hear him say that?
And the garage was located, well, across from the urban estates, where the main house was, right on that hard curve on St. Charles. One of the houses got tore up during the tornado. And we lived there for a couple of years. And then we moved 3 or 4 houses east of there. It happened to be the same property, different house, of course, but same property is where the mayor lives today.
What? Wait a minute, this mayor right here?
This
This
man.
mayor right here.
Did you know that?
Sure, but not the same house. Not the same house.
But in the same location?
Yes.
Actually, it was a small two-room home, two-room house, 5 acres. We rented. We didn't own, we rented. And at that point, you mentioned the interview you had the other day about the girls not having plumbing and all that.
Right.
We had no plumbing.
Oh,
We had 2 rooms and a path.
a path. Oh, you mean they went outside?
Oh,
2 rooms and a
We went
path.
outside.
And livestock.
in 55.
Sorry?
Livestock.
Livestock, cow,
We had a couple cows that lived on that property where the mayor did.
and huge garden.
That's right. Actually, it was 5 acres. It was the same width as it is now, but it was deeper. It went back into where Harmon Estates go, back in there.
So let me ask you something. The first place you lived in was the 2-car garage, and then the second place, were they owned by the same person?
No.
Oh,
Actually, the first place was owned, the people that lived in the house owned it. I know she's passed on, so 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm not sure about him.
I think he died before he did.
Well, they divorced, I think. But a minister owned the property where the mayor lived. He was a minister, lived down in the city somewhere. And, well, like I mentioned livestock, we had a couple cows, and I milked morning and night. And the minister would give me 50 cents a gallon for milk. And he would take to give to his parishioners that lived down the city. So it kept me, I bought all the feed, I had no place to raise feed or anything.
Was this in the 50s?
Yeah, early 50s.
It was 55 when we moved up there. At that time, well, we lived there, 57, 56, 57, 58. We moved in 59 where we live today.
where do you live today?
We live on Raymond Avenue, 4700 block.
Yeah.
So you still live by the river?
Well, not really. Actually,
He hasn't moved yet, I'm not going, so.
on the same as the interview you had the other day about Interstate 70, every morning when I would milk my cows, I could sit there in the barn and I could watch them filling their equipment down where they cross St. Charles Rock Road, they don't divide out thing. I'd be out there at 5 o'clock, and they'd be down there.
So you did that, and then you went to work at McDonald Douglas?
Oh, yeah.
Or, is that what it was called?
McDonald at that time, but
Okay.
later McDonald.
Okay. And you also told us a story about a runaway cow, didn't you? I thought I remember something like that.
I had a couple stories on the cows, of course, but actually where Bridgeway subdivision is, at that time it was a pasture or a farm, big old house and barns up on a hill, and a Boston. I'm not sure his first name, but he had excavating equipment, lived in St. Anne. He raised Hereford cattle, raised them run on that pasture. And, well, I talked to him, I never met the man, never talked to him personally, it was all on telephone. But he told me I could use his bull for service. Yeah.
Did everybody hear that one?
And as far as the runaway cow, actually, I got up one morning to go out and milk. She wasn't in the pasture. I couldn't find her. And I had a couple neighbor boys that they had a cow also. And I told Mary I was gonna have to get hold of the boys to see if they can find that cow. So I got to go to work. So they found her. She was over in Doc Harmon's pasture. He had Angus cattle over there. And, well, they brought her home. That evening, Mr. Harmon came over and very unhappy.
Why was he unhappy?
Well, he didn't like that cow minding the pasture with his bulls. But, we had a discussion. Of course, I don't know, at that time, I was probably 25, 26 years old, somewhere in that area. And, got up the next morning, she was gone again.
What's the saying? It's greener in the other pasture, or the grass is greener.
I knew where to look for her. I went over and sure enough, there she was. Put a rope around her neck. I knew where there was a gap, farther west from old St. Charles, in behind the houses up there. So I just put a rope around her neck, brought her over to the gap, came out on old St. Charles. 4:30 in the morning, I was leading her down the road. But, that was just life with animals, that's all.
But this is what we don't see anymore in Bridgeton, do we? A man walking a cow down the road.
There's still one or two in the neighborhood.
Over by you.
There's a couple cows in the neighborhood.
Well, let's go over to Kevin, since he has knowledge of cows in the neighborhood.
When I asked the mayor if we can still get a permit to live in a two-car garage.
And if it'll pass the occupancy.
That's, I bet you know some
The
people.
world has changed.
Yeah.
Nobody would want to rent a two-car garage now.
Kevin, you were born and raised in Bridgeton?
Yeah, born and raised here, been here all my life. I'm 45, spent all my years here. And it's nice, thank you for asking me to be here. And it's nice to look out and see generation to generation. It's something I notice about Bridgeton in our community. People tend to not leave. And that's really, really nice to see. Because so many communities just dissipate, and there's a lot of people that like it here, and it's nice to be here.
Now, your mother and father, did they work or, participate in Bridgeton?
Absolutely. My mom was something you don't see much today. She was a house mom.
And
Dad did work at McDonnell Douglas for a bit, the blueprint department, and worked for Emerson Electric the rest of the time.
he also worked, didn't he, at the golf course?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Dad repaired the golf carts. That was later on.
Oh,
His dad was kind of getting towards his retirement years. He worked for Walt when Walt was the pro over at Berry Hill, and yeah, Dad was the guy that fixed all the golf carts. Actually, that's probably his favorite job. He played golf for free.
play golf for free,
Yeah.
that was a biggie. And I had experience with Kevin's mom because she had a ceramics,
Her and my grandmother, actually, the home that I live in, which belonged to my grandparents, I live on Main. My mother taught and my grandmother a ceramics class. And it was just kind of a hobby for them, but it kind of took over the entire basement. And I can vividly remember my grandfather, they had a kiln, which Miss Bowers would know a lot about. They had a kiln that they put in the basement, but it had to have special electrical hookups, because it ran on 220. And I can remember my grandfather getting that electric bill every month and just turning beet red every time they had to turn that thing on. And I'm sure it wasn't too much that it cost to turn it on. It didn't cost the whole world, but I ended up taking over the whole basement for the whole, a whole lot of years. It was it's a ranch-style house with a good-sized basement, and it was just full of everything that had to do with doing ceramics. That was a big part of their lives.
and I was able to bring my brownie or Girl Scout troop over. Kevin's mom was so nice and had little things they could paint, and she was very gracious about letting the girls come.
She always enjoyed doing the room mother thing for myself and my younger brother. So there's
And which
always,
school was that?
well, I went to Pattonville, so Pattonville on the original Pattonville grade school, elementary, on Fifi, which was the original Bridgeton Community Center for a number of years, prior to the current, almost now gone, community center. And then it was a bank, I guess. It was still their offices. And then Holman Middle School, which was the high school, I'm assuming, when you went. and then Pattonville High School.
So you didn't go to Carrollton?
No, I did. I guess third grade, they closed Pattonville Elementary and shipped us all over.
Oh.
So for fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, I went to Carrollton.
And this is another thing we found out in our interviews of where people went to schools, you know, and what the schools were like. Before we leave Kevin, I want him to tell us one other story, which I thought was good. Nobody else told us about it. It was about a particularly interesting event that happened very close to his neighborhood.
Sure. Just a couple houses up the street. I mean, does anybody remember when the airplane crashed here? I was 12, maybe 13, and this Miss Bowers, she was my high school art teacher. We've known each other a lot
Was
of
he a
years.
nice kid?
He was great.
Oh, okay.
She remembers the.
Remembers good and bad.
Okay, you get the thumbs up.
I play a lot of music, and I remember very vividly, I was sitting in my bedroom playing my guitar very loudly, which fortunately for me, my parents tolerated. And the lights flickered, and I had just naturally assumed I'd blown another fuse. And so did my mother. She came down and beat on the door. And the lights came back on after a couple of minutes. And so I continued to make noise. And maybe another 15 or 20 minutes passed by, and my mom was beating on the bedroom door again. I'm trying to figure out what I did wrong this time. So she said, come with me, you gotta see this. So she drugged me out to the front yard and took me to the end of the street. And we looked up the street, maybe a block and a half, and there were more sirens, ambulances, fire trucks than I'd ever seen gathered in any one place. And as we walked a little closer, you could see the wreckage of a very large airplane that had somehow managed to land between the highway, which was full of automobiles, and all the residential homes. And the airplane was just sitting there, and it's just a very odd sight to...
Was it on fire?
No, there was, I think there was some smoke, there was no flames at this point that I remember. And the folks, the Grellners live, they have the last house on Benedetta. And if you go back many, many years before Avery was a street, Benedetta was the entrance and exit at that end of the neighborhood. So there was no, well, there's two sections to Avery. So the one that runs parallel to Benedetta was the new section. The other section was there, but anyway, that was the street's still there, and they live in the very last house on the corner. So it was their house that was literally missed by 15 feet, and they were three boys in the family, mom, dad, or four Grellner boys. Anyway, you think about the amount of lives that could have been lost in that kind of tragedy. It was that family. I think there's a pilot and a co-pilot in the plane, if I recall correctly. But for whatever reason, initially they thought there were three. It was a cargo plane, large cargo plane. They thought there were three pilots, and they located two. One passed away. One, I think, just recently passed. One survived. But they originally thought there were three. I remember that family spent a good 45 minutes or an hour just kind of, they were trying to find this third person that really was never there. But, and the wreckage sat there for 3 or 4 days, maybe even a week or so.
Does anyone recall that?
What year was that?
Oh my God, it would have been early 80s, 82, 83.
Ken had a question.
It was just refilled at Lambert, and they put the wrong fuel in it, and that's why I couldn't fly, and it came down.
Did
They
change all the
they
plans?
fill it with diesel.
Yeah.
You're right.
They
It's very
changed all the
sad.
plans so that
It
it
was
never
a
happened
DC.
again.
Yes.
They changed it so you couldn't put the hose in like they do at a filling station. You can't put the hose
Exactly.
in the wrong
But
one.
very,
But
very
that was
sad.
not the case then.
We recognized the pilot at the city, in fact, I was involved, but it was a DC-3 cargo plane.
Which is a large plane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that he had went down, and they were able to miss. Yeah, interesting.
How long did it take before they could move the plane away?
Off the top of my head, it was at least a week or so.
Anytime in Floyd, anytime there's an accident like that, and the FAA gets involved to investigate, things don't happen very quick.
Sure.
That's right, they're slow.
Well, I do remember that at the top of Avery, I guess when the plane had lost altitude, it had enough fuel, I think, in the line, its proper fuel in the lines to get up off the ground.
Yeah.
And then as it started to come down, the wing hit the telephone pole at the top of Avery,
Yeah.
and part of the wing was in the front yard at the top. But it was amazing that the pilots had enough concern to aim for this strip of grass that was just between, and if you drive by there, that you can see that it's not a very large space, that they were able to actually crash land this airplane in.
We did recognize the pilots at the city, you know, with the resolution, and that's in the records, and, you know, I've forgotten about the names and everything else, but that information is
Well,
there.
and
you know.
I had assumed that both pilots had passed away, and somebody brought to my attention just a few weeks ago that one of the pilots had survived, and he just recently passed away,
Wow.
within the last year or two.
Yeah.
And I think it was like the co-pilot of the Navigator that passed away in the crash. But it was, yeah, listen, you just don't see that
Right.
every day, and it's sad, but it could have been a whole lot worse. If he'd have been 30 feet the other way, there's an entire street of homes that could have been gone, and it happened late in the evening, so a lot of people would have been home, and it was during the week, so
It was pretty interesting, but like I said, Kevin's interview, out of the over 50 we've had, he was the only one that recalled this incident, so it was a particularly interesting piece of information. I'd like to go to Jenny. You know, Jenny, when Joe and I, her husband and I, started doing these interviews, it was because of her father that we opened, the doors opened for us, and people let us come in to have interviews. And not dismissing Jenny herself, because she's a wonderful person. And, but I just would like Jenny to tell us a little bit about your father. How did he come by coming to Bridgeton?
Well, he was born here. My maiden name is Banker, B-O-E-N-K-E-R. We have a road named after us, after my grandfather, great-grandfather, August Banker, who lived on Banker Road, which was the beginning of, when I was growing up, was Old Highway 40, which circled to the old bridge going into St. Charles. So it was kind of a loop that you could go one way to St. Charles and come back another way.
Wait a minute, was that loop anywhere connected with the quarry now?
You could even go through the quarry. The school bus, I too went to St. Mary's grade school, where Kathleen did, and got my piano lessons from the nuns in the convent in that beautiful old structure. And then when Carrollton was built, they put in a new school and church, St. Lawrence the Martyr. So I was in St. Mary's from kindergarten through 7th grade and had to move over in my last year, but that was okay. And then from St. Lawrence, I went to Sacred Heart Academy in St. Charles on the public service bus, or with girlfriends, parents that drove us. And then we'd come home on the service bus every night. And my aunt, my grandfather's sister, was a waitress at the station in St. Charles, was at Duquette. And we'd walk from Sacred Heart Academy to the station house to catch the bus, and she would have my ice cream soda waiting for me. And that was Agnes Brannicky. My grandfather, Banker, this was his sister, Agnes. There were 12 children in the Banker family, and they married a brother and a sister, married a brother and sister Brannicky. And so that's why the Brannickys and Bankers are interrelated, and two very substantial families in the Bridgeton area. The Bankers had 12 children, the Brannickys had 3, but there were other Brannickys, and Hollenberg, there's a Hollenberg Lane, my great-grandmother was a Hollenberg. And when Dad was born, he was born at the family farm, which are in some of these photos. And that was where the Fred Weber Quarry is now on Creek Court Mill. And that was a 100-acre tract farm for the Branickies, and my banker grandfather had a 100-acre farm where we still live on Banker Hill. And they met and married and had children, and a sad part of the Banker family line, I don't think we mentioned this in the interview, was my grandfather and grandmother were going to church with her brother Sam, or Hank Branicki, and they were hit by a train.
Oh,
And they're.
where was this? Where was this?
It was on Miller's Curve, I want to say, no, over where the Maryland Heights Aqua, there's a train track, and now it goes under the highway, but then the road went, and they were going to church on Dorset Road, Zion Lutheran on Dorset. And the train hit them, and Grandpa and Grandma both went to the hospital. Grandpa had a gold plate put in his head. You wouldn't have known that. No, that was way too early. This was 1920, and the 8-year-old daughter, Esther, died, and she's buried in Fifi Cemetery, and she's buried in the Branicki plot because Grandma and Grandpa were still in the hospital, and so the grandparents had to bury their granddaughter. And my grandmother was pregnant with my father, Edward, and so thankfully she didn't miscarry, and Dad was born 6 months later in May. But, and that's why we think Dad was given so much love from his grandmother and grandfather and his parents that he turned around and loved everybody else. And he was a very hard worker, and he worked on his farm, which they raised hogs and had milk cows and chickens. And so then when he married my mother, he thought Mama should have cows and chickens and pigs. And so when I was growing up, the pigs were named Mary, Jenny, and Christy by my brothers. And then we never named the chickens. But the cow was named Rosie after my fourth sister. And Mama milked the cow, and Lucy did too. Lucy had horses. I'm one of 10
Now, which
children.
one is Lucy?
Lucy is the baby in the family, and she graduated from Rolla, and her first job at MoDOT was to widen and take a curve out of Banker Lane. And I think that's when they finally named it Banker Lane instead of the old Highway 40. I don't know how that ever, we know where Highway 4064 is, but how this was Highway 40, I don't know. But it was Anglem, then Robertson when I was born, and lived on Fifi Road, where my father, after the war, ran a tomboy grocery store that Archie Null was involved. He built the store, and he was a builder in Bridgeton. His son, John Null, who passed away about 3 years ago, was a builder. Now his son, Bruce Null, is a builder in Bridgeton. And so the Nulls and Mr. Null was also on the Pattonville School Board with Mr. Holman. And so the names Holman and Null and Banker and Branicki are synonymous with the town of Bridgeton, which was at that time Robertson. And then it came to Bridgeton, and again, my father was very civic-minded, and he was on the town council in the 60s, and then he became a Kiwanis member in his retirement, and made apple butter, which he had all the copper pots from his mother's old farm. So I'm very privileged to still live in the family farm, and hopefully we'll stay there, but with all the turmoil going on in Bridgeton over the landfill, we've been propositioned to be bought out, but it's not worth it right yet. If they'd offer us something like they did the people in the trailer courts in some Spanish Village, that it's a stipend, but they haven't even offered us enough to pay for the dirt that's on our land. So I guess they don't need it, and we don't really teach it. But there are, a funny thing that my grandparents did, my grandmother had her 100-acre farm, so she gave her inheritance to her 3 children and a cousin, Roy Brannicky, who is a very good family member, a cousin of my father's. So that farm was divided up with the children. So Grandpa, who owned the 40 acres where we live, he said, I'll give the 40 acres to the grandchildren. So we are 17 tenants in common.
Oh, wow.
And there's a history of how do you divide something up when some want to keep the farm and someone. So we're working it out. We're trying to work it out. Very painful.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to go back here to Floyd and Mary. Also, I don't know if it was brought out on our interview, but talking to them recently, I found out that Floyd was actually a volunteer fireman at Bridgeton, correct?
That's correct.
Did any of you, or I did not know until we interviewed the Dewson family, Mike and Sharon and his mother, that there was a volunteer fire department here in Bridgeton. I honestly did not know that. So I was fascinated with that. And here we have one of the volunteer firemen. So
The last of the volunteer.
the last of the volunteer firemen. Can you let Mary tell the story about how the phone system worked? Because Mrs. Dushan was saying to us during the interview, oh, we had a fire phone. And I went, a fire phone? What's a fire phone? So what is a fire phone?
Well, it was a system, there were 2 women, one of the 2 were always 3 at home. And they each one had what they called a fire phone, it was a red phone. And whenever one of them would leave, they'd go grocery shopping or to school or whatever, they'd be sure somebody else was there to answer that phone. And then when they picked up that red phone, it was a simultaneous ring on all the firemen's phones, so that we were all notified at the same time with just a signal in the phone. So that was kind of updated modern for this, what, 70s, 60s and 70s. So, but he was the last of the volunteer firemen in Bridgeton. So
Well, what if like he was at work and there was a fire? Then what would you guys do?
nothing. If he wasn't there, I didn't go. The only time I ever went for any fire things was occasionally there'd be one late at night, and we would fix a big pot of coffee and take it to the scene so that the guys could have something to kind of give themselves a little extra energy.
What, were they involved in the fires like that happened at Brannicky Hardware?
Yeah, actually, the phone, just slightly different than what she just stated, but there was actually 3 families that had phones in their home. Brannicky Hardware also had a phone in the store.
Oh.
In fact, at one time, Charlie Brannicky, the older brother, was fire chief for a short period of time back in the 50s. Pardon me. But when you got a fire call, they had outside bells and everything, and they had to set up between which one would answer the phone. They always knew where the other people were at. They had to stay in correspondence that way. And one person would answer the phone, and when they determined it wasn't a fire call, they started calling the volunteers.
How many do you think were volunteers?
We had in the neighborhood of 20, 25.
Were volunteers like really trained? Like, did you take a course in firefighting?
Well, let's put it this way. I recall when I joined the fire department, there was really no pattern. You know, they take you out and they try to explain the trucks to you and you know what to do here and there. And you mentioned Dewson. Joe Dewson's the one that got onto the chief about qualifying me as an engineer. And about that same time, shortly thereafter, at a meeting with we met once a month in a local department dinner meeting, and I suggested for the good of the department that we have a training officer. And the chief was Chief McCoubrey, which you interviewed his sons the other day. Chief George McCoubrey was a volunteer also. We was all volunteer, everybody was volunteer.
So that means no pay.
You receive no pay at all.
No pay.
I mean, all you got was criticism.
Oh.
I think most people here know that, working on different parts of the city. But anyway, they would pick up the phone, they'd start calling the volunteers, and all they would say was fire. And that was it.
Well, how do you know where it was, or where to go?
We went to the firehouse.
Which was where?
The firehouse, well, it's vacant now, I don't know what's in it right now, it's the old firehouse on Phoebe Road.
Oh, that tall, skinny fire
At
building?
that time, it was a concrete block, about a 2.5 car garage, concrete block. I know prior to that, before they had a firehouse, they parked it in the Texaco garage up on St. Charles Rock Road. And also, one of the Schraders lived on Tapman. He put it in his garage for a while. But we all reported to the firehouse. And then we take the equipment out as needed, and if we needed more manpower, we'd all get in one vehicle and come to the scene to help us. And, like I said, it was strictly volunteer. I got our first paid fireman in 1963, I believe it was. Might have been 64. When they built the firehouse, it used to sit on the corner of McKelvey and St. Charles Rock Road. Actually, the day they dedicated that building was one of the, well, I guess, worst fires I ever.
Oh, my God.
There was 2 little girls perished in the fire in what was Bridgeton Terrace over, I'm not sure the name of the street, St. Teresa, I think, but I'm not sure. And we had the fire there about, I don't know, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we had 2 little girls perished in the fire. And, well, they wouldn't have the dedication of the building, but Robertson covered our fire department that day. Firemen weren't in condition to take care of it. And, well, I started hiring firemen in 1970 or thereabouts. They hired their first paid chief. And they built up to where they had more firemen. And in 1976, I answered my last call.
Okay, so you kind of hung in with them.
Yeah, actually, it was kind of rough the last, probably 8, 10 years. I was actually an officer on the department. In fact, they made me training officer when I suggested them, but being a training officer, I knew very little about fire department, to be honest with you. And at that time, there was no education. You didn't go to college, or well, if they did, I didn't know it. And myself and another volunteer, we wrote training manuals for the department to where everybody could operate the same way, trying to get uniform. And it worked out. When they started hiring the paid firemen, it kind of rubbed them. I was second officer, and if the chief wasn't there, they had to take all their orders from me. And volunteers or paid men taking orders from volunteers didn't rub too good. But we made it. I mean, we had really no major problems, as far as I know. So, actually, in the fall of 1976, I was the last volunteer. I mean, when I hung my gear up, that was it. So.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate your volunteerism even then. I want to bring the discussion over back to Kathleen Telscher. She also told us the story. I asked her pointedly, why did you open up a hardware store? Can you tell us? Well, is that question on anybody else's mind? Why did you open up a hardware store?
Well, I was 23, and my husband was back from service from overseas, and his dad had a small dairy farm. So Julius was farming, and what he did, he milked 10 cows every morning and evening for his father, and his father gave him $30 a month. And then he got $100 a month from the government to go to school for agriculture. And he was renting ground here and there, but he had terrible allergies. and he'd come home at night and he'd be going, and I thought, oh, I said, you're gonna be dead by the time you're 40. I said, we were buying corn pickers, combines. I was working in the city, and so, as a secretary. And so I said, we gotta do something else. So I got a book from the library, and I read up on which business was least apt to fail. And a hardware store was it.
Can you believe it? She actually did research.
So when I saw that, I thought, well, that's what we'll do. We'll have a hardware store. Well, I was working, this evolved, I was working for the post office. And the postmaster, Bud Kruger, his father owned the building that the post office was in and several others, and he was going to build another one. And his sister, Mr. Kruger's sister Bernice, was going to open a hardware store. So the next day when I came into work, he said, well, Bernice can't open the hardware store because you got to have 10,000 cash, and she's only got 2,000.
Where was this hardware store going to be that?
Right on the old natural bridge that went up where the airport is now, of course. It's about a block before Cypress Road. And so anyway, when she is going to open a bakery, he said, well, she didn't end up opening anything. But it gave me the idea after reading my book and her saying it. So we didn't have any money because we were buying these corn pickers and combines. We spent everything we had buying equipment. So I knew I had to get money. So I went to my husband's brother, because my husband would never ask anybody for anything. He was proud. Well, I went to his brother and I said, Joe, I need $10,000. And he wanted to know why. And I said, because I'm going to open a hardware store. He gave me the $10,000 on a little note, and I paid him back $1,000 every time I got a chance. But he charged me 6%. So anyway, we opened the hardware store, and I kept working at the post office for a year. And I'd get up.
Wait, excuse me. What year was this that you opened this hardware store?
1950.
And where was the post office that you worked in?
Right next door to where the hardware store was. Well, anyway, I lost my train of
You would
thought.
get up and work at the post
Yeah,
office?
so I would get up at 4 o'clock and I'd go up to the hardware store and get things organized. Then I'd walk to the post office from 8 till 12, and I'd come back from 12 to 3 at the hardware store. Then I'd go from 3 to 5 when the mail came in to the post office. Then I'd go back to the hardware store and stay till 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock at night?
Oh, yeah.
And your kids were how old?
Well, I didn't have any at that time.
Oh.
But I did have them after we moved into a 3-room apartment, and I had intercoms in each room. And later we built a 3-story building, and I had intercoms in every room. And in fact, there was an African-American place in Anglem, and they used to shop in our store all the time. And they'd come in and they'd say, Mrs. Telser, would you get your daughter to whistle? And my oldest daughter, who's now 61, she was like 9 months old. And I'd turn on the intercom and I'd say, Peggy, whistle. And she'd whistle for me. Oh my goodness. It was just like I was giving them a gift. They loved it. But anyway.
And when did your hardware store move from the Natural Bridge location to the Carrollton location?
I'll tell you, but I got a little story to tell in between about this, about the hardware store. Everybody was laughing at me because I was young and a woman and I opened a hardware store. Well, Joe Vatterott had airport lumber 1 block away, and Brannick's had been there 1 mile away for 5 generations. So one of my girlfriends told me later, she said, we were all laughing at you. We said, a woman open a hardware store, a young woman with that competition, she'll last a year. But I fooled them. I lasted 47, and I wouldn't have closed up if it hadn't been struck by lightning. But then, now moving to Carrollton, John Fisher called me and he said, I'm building this subdivision. and I'm going to have a strip mall, and I'm gonna give you first chance at the hardware store. I said, John, I don't wanna go to a strip mall. I said, I got all these accounts, I'm doing fine, I don't need it. He said, oh, come on, I'm gonna take you out to dinner. Well, this is a cute story, I think. He was gonna take us to Nantucket Cove, if you know where Nantucket was, down on Kings Highway. And so he called and he said, oh, Kathleen, he said, my car broke down, I don't have a car.
Oh.
Would you pick us up? And we'll go to Nantucket Cove. That was before they were rich. And so we went, and we got to Nantucket Cove at 11 o'clock at night.
Wow.
Oh, my gosh.
So, anyway, he talked me into it finally, and I kept both stores. And I took my sister Helen and our Copa, who's now deceased, and they were going to run the Carrollton store. Well, they did, but the first 6 months, we lost $5,000. And I thought, oh my God, I gotta do something. So I decided to close the store and move down there and rent my building out, which I did. I rented to McDonnell Douglas for their employment office, and later I rented it to Ozark Airlines, and later I rented it to the food service that served Ozark. And then finally the airport, I was in Greece, and I come back, and Roy Gittemar told me that he had just sold his building, which had a bar, and the doctor's office, the dentist's office, Dr. Shuey. And he said, they're gonna take your building too. Well, I couldn't do anything with it. And there I had this beautiful building, and I got, I don't remember now, I think $165,000 for it, but I should have gotten double that. But anyway, that's beside the point. So anyway, the first year I was down there, at the end of the year, there was a toy store next door, and they went bankrupt. So I took that wall out, and I took over that store. Then the dime store next door went bankrupt, so I took that wall out. Then the drugstore went out of business, so I took that wall out. So I took over 4 stores. So one day, we were taking a 3-day trip up to Minneapolis, I think, to see some kind of show, a play. And I said to I was sleeping in the car, and he's driving. And I woke up and I said, I got it, I got it. He said, oh God, no. I said, that ceiling in where the dime store was and the drugstore is tall. I think we're gonna build a balcony. So I built it, I had to pay for it. And so Fisher and Fritchell, owned it, but the ground, and I rented from them, so I built the balcony. And that's where I had the art classes and your glitter. Thank you. So anyway, that was the story of that.
I took art classes also over there one time, just for fun, and
Well, I gotta tell you about her grandpa. Her grandpa, Ed's father, used to shop in my store. And I always was amazed.
wait a minute. He came to Telshers when he was related to the Brannickes, and the Brannickes were there, and he didn't go to the Brannickes?
I don't know, I guess they were curious how a girl could run the hardware store. But he'd bring me flowers in the springtime.
Oh.
Every time he came in, I'd get a bouquet of their garden flowers. And he was just that, I guess your grandma picked them and
Yes, Grandma had tuberoses, if you know that flower, and we still have Grandma's tuberoses because they multiply. And 2 years ago, well, 3 years ago, the year my father died, and the year before that, we sold tuberoses to the Dew florist.
Oh, wow.
And Dad said that was the best cash crop. They make beautiful lace in Hawaii with the tuberose, and in France, they use them for perfume, and they only smell at nighttime, night blooming like jasmine. And so Grandpa would probably bring you tuberoses. Grandma was an excellent gardener.
I want to go back to Kevin. Kevin also talked about something I think is kind of pertinent. You lived, right by the existing community center?
Yes.
You still live there?
Yes.
and you said you were watching it being built, and you said,
Spent a lot of time in it before it was open. There were no windows and doors. So we just, as kids, we played in and out all over the place. It was, there were mounds of dirt and places to climb and crawl, and back then it was different being a kid. So we rode our bicycles everywhere. There was, one of the popular destinations for the kids in the neighborhood was the old 7-Eleven. And it was always fun to just ride your bicycle out of the neighborhood and down to the Slurpee machine at 7-Eleven and then back into the neighborhood. And we did everything on our bikes. And through Gentry Park, and some of them are still there. And then I guess something I want to talk to the mayor about, because there's the federal property. There's a whole lot of trails in Gentry Park that are now, I guess, designated. And whoever designated them took credit for them, and they were there a long time before somebody put up a sign that said this trail goes here. And so the woods was much bigger when I was a kid, and we would go from one side of the neighborhood to the other side of the neighborhood through Gentry Park, and it was kind of like a central location for us and the generation of kids before us. And you could get anywhere in Bridgeton through the park. So the community center was on the way, so we spent a lot of time there, and as they built it and dug things, it was really convenient to kind of ride your bike. And I've ridden in the pool. Oh, absolutely, and the gym, and at that point, you didn't know what anything was. And the ramp that goes down was also very convenient to, you just basically rode your bike in what is now the front door, and just go down the ramp, and
well, now let me ask you something. When the new community center is being built, starting this fall maybe?
we're gonna have to do some exploring.
Yeah.
There is a difference. Who was ever building that actually went bankrupt, and it was about the time I started getting involved. So it went on for quite a period of time. And unfortunately, that's some of the problems we have today. The building had a lot of problems, has a lot of problems.
If you go back to where the senior garden is now, that is essentially a huge mound of dirt. And that mound of dirt mostly came from digging out the foundation of where the current building sits. So that piece of ground, when I was growing up, was about 12 feet shorter. And it was kind of like a much bigger field. For months, there were these two huge mounds of dirt that were 40, 50, maybe 60 feet tall. They were just massive. And we used to climb to the top of them all the time. And they took all of that dirt and kind of spread it out, and it just kept getting taller and taller. So now you get this big field now that kind of covers the top of where.
Is that the center that's on Long Road?
It's on Fifi and Long Road and Avery kind of.
We used to come from Normandy to go to the swimming pool.
Really?
It was so beautiful.
Yeah, it was
the best thing around.
I miss, the new outdoor pool is fantastic, but from a nostalgia standpoint, I miss the old pool that we grew up in. It was a really nice thing to do.
You grew up in it and on a bike.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, so watching the community center get built was something that was neat for me as a kid, and a lot of kids in the neighborhood.
But you're close enough now that you can,
I work out there, I'm there 5 days a week.
and what do you do there 5 days?
I work out 5 mornings a week at the Bridgeton.
In what way?
We walk.
No, but I want you to tell
We
them.
do a lot of walking and the weight room, actually.
So you definitely use the community center?
Oh, yes. It's been a focal point of, it's odd. It's been a focal point for me for a very, very long time. Very long time.
And do you use the community center?
I do.
What do you do there?
I swim 3 days a week, trying to keep Arthur away.
Oh,
It's working.
Good for you.
And Jenny?
I swim 3 days a week too at the community center. My mother swam there a couple times and really would have gone more, but Dad wouldn't take her, so he said, go Helen if you want to go and swim. But it's been a wonderful piece of building and center for a lot of people in Bridgeton, Maryland Heights, Hazelwood. We have a swimmer from Hazelwood. So.
What's interesting too is the gentleman that runs the community center, Joe Campbell.
Uh-huh.
I remember when Joe started, Joe was just the guy that took your card at the front desk. Joe's been there, I mean, I know Walt's been there a very long time, too. Walt runs the Parks Department. Yeah, Joe's been there before that community center. Actually, when you went back, Joe worked at the original community center